All right, so let's do 5 and 6 real quick. Looking at number 5, I think we all would agree you probably want to start on this side. And with all of this, we probably want to put everything in terms of sine and cosine. So we'll do that first. Sine theta over cosine theta is tangent. Cosine over sine is cotangent. So we've got that. We've got the same thing here, but with a plus sign. And we will notice that we have a complex fraction. So we need to get rid of the complex fraction. So we look at all our denominators. We have a sine and we have a cosine. So that's what we have to multiply by. Sine theta, cosine theta, over itself. So that's what you need to multiply by to get rid of that. All right, in the first fraction, when you multiply by this, again, this is like sine cosine over 1. So this is in the numerator, that's in the denominator. It goes away, so we're left with sine squared. In the second fraction, the sine is in the numerator. Here, sine is in the denominator. They go away. I'm left with minus cosine squared. Over, here when I multiply, the cosines go away, so sine squared. And here the sine goes away, so I'm left with plus cosine squared. And I realized as I did all this, I forgot this little piece up here. I better add that to this. It was all of this fraction plus 2 cosine squareds. And it's all of this fraction plus 2 cosine squareds. We can't forget all of that side. All right, so I look at this and say, well, what can I do with this now? Well, I see that I've got sine squared plus cosine squared. That's 1. So I really have sine squared theta minus cosine squared theta over 1. So if you want to put over 1, you can, to show that that's 1, plus 2 cosine squareds. And if you want to put that over 1, you can. You don't have to. So when I go to add these together, because this became 1, it went away. So now I just have sine squared minus cosine squared plus 2 cosine squareds. So I'm going to have a sine squared. When I put these like terms together, I get 1 cosine squared. And sine squared plus cosine squared is 1. And that's where I was trying to get to. So really, we just put this in terms of sine and cosine. We got rid of the complex fraction. This was 1, and then it was just a matter of adding your like terms. All right, so that one wasn't too bad. Number 6, though, is going to be a little bit harder, I think. It's like the one I did the other day in class, where we've got these 3 terms on top and 3 terms on bottom, and we want to get to one, like a single term on the bottom. So we need to group these somehow. I probably would group it like this and say it's 1 plus sine minus cosine. I would think of this as my A and that is my B. And since I'm doing that to save myself a little work, I prefer to do is I'm going to group it the same up on the top. So this is like A plus B, and this is like A minus B. So I'm going to get rid of this. To get rid of that or get rid of some of that, I'm going to multiply by its conjugate. The conjugate of the denominator is the 1 plus sine plus cosine. Now I pick the denominator because then, I can break it up into different parts if I have one thing in the denominator. So then the numerator I have to multiply by the same thing. 1 plus sine plus the cosine. All right, now, if you want, you really can just ignore the parentheses because it's a plus sign, and you can distribute the 1. Take 1 times 1, 1 times sine, 1 times cosine, and then distribute the sine. Sine times 1, sine times sine, sine times cosine, and then distribute the cosine. Cosine times 1. So for some of you, I think that might be easier. I look at this and just think of it as my A and B. So I would say when I go to multiply these two together, I'm going to get 1 plus sine quantity squared. 1 plus sine times 1 plus sine. The inner product, I'm going to get cosine times what's in that parentheses. The outer product is going to give me cosine. So I'm going to have 2 of those cosines times 1 plus sines. And I'll have to FOIL that out or multiply that out. And then my last term, I'm going to get plus cosine squared. So I'm going to still have to do some algebra with all of that, but it makes it easier just to kind of get started that I don't have all that foiling to do. In the denominator, it's really going to be easier because now I'm going to take my a's, 1 plus sine, and I'm going to square those. So I'm multiplying by itself. Middle term is going to drop out because they are conjugates of each other, and then I'm left with minus cosine squared. All right, so that's kind of what I'm left with after I multiply by that conjugate. Now I do have to do some multiplying. I have to take 1 plus sine times itself. So if you need to off to the side figure out what that is, I can do that by thinking of, okay, I'm going to square the first one, my outer and inner product, add them together, I'm going to have 2 sines plus my sine squared. When I distribute this 2 cosine theta, I'm going to get 2 cosine theta plus 2 cosine sine. And then I still have my plus cosine squared. All right, a lot of terms, but I think we can put some of them together. In the denominator, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to multiply that out. 1 plus 2 sine plus sine squared minus cosine squared. So now we got to see what can we put together, what can we factor, look for those Pythagorean identities. So I see one Pythagorean identity right here. Sine squared plus cosine squared is 1. So I'm going to say that that's 1 plus the one I already have right here. So I'm going to have 2. And then I'm going to have 2 sine thetas. I'm going to have 2 cosine thetas. And I'm going to have 2 cosine sine. All right, that's everything in the numerator. In the denominator, different ways I can put this together, but I see a 1 minus cosine squared. That's sine squared. So if I take 1 minus cosine squared, it's sine squared, plus the sine squared I already have there. So that's 2 sine squareds plus 2 sine. Now, right away you might start to think, oh, they all have 2's. So if we wanted to, at this point, we could just factor out the 2's. So if you don't like all of those 2's, as long as everything has a 2 in it, we could factor out a 2 and move from there. So I'm going to rewrite that over here. You probably won't be able to see it, but I'll rewrite what I've got. I'm just taking this and dividing and factoring out a 2 in the numerator and factoring out a 2 in the denominator. So when I do that, I'm going to get 2 times, don't forget that with this one, that's got to be a 1. So I have to take something out. So it's going to be 1 plus sine theta plus cosine theta plus cosine sine. Okay? In the denominator, when I factor out a 2, I'm going to be left with sine squared theta plus sine theta. So if you just want to take care of that first, you can. You could have kind of done all of that at one time, but sometimes you want to get rid of those numbers to help out a little bit. All right, so I have 1, 2, 3, 4 terms in the numerator. So I'm going to have to factor by grouping. First 2 have nothing in common, so I'm just going to take out a 1. 1 plus sine theta. The second 2 have a cosine in common, so I'm going to factor out a cosine. And I'm left with 1 plus sine. In the denominator, I'm just going to factor out a sine. I'll be left with sine plus 1. Now, in the numerator, I have 2 terms. They have a 1 plus sine in common, so it really factors into 1 plus sine. And what's left would be a 1 in this term and a plus cosine in that term. All over sine times sine plus 1. All right, now I see that 1 plus sines cancel, and I'm left with a 1 plus cosine all over a sine. And that's where I wanted to get to. Okay, so again, a lot of algebra. Knowing that you want to do that conjugate thing, making sure you know how to group those so that you can look for a conjugate. Knowing what you get when you FOIL all of that out. Again, you can do it the other way and just distribute every term. You could do it that way as well. But then once you do that and add your like terms, use your Pythagorean identities, you should have come up with this. And again, you can factor out the 2 first if you want to. That's what we did. Factored out the 2. And then when I had 4 terms, I had to factor by grouping. So I grouped those 2 together, and I grouped those 2 together and factored. So that is the end of worksheet 3. We'll be having a quiz probably Wednesday or Thursday. So you need to make sure you're kind of staying up on all of those worksheets, and get in to see me if you need some extra help.